This is the presentation I gave in Naperville this past fall. My railroad is complete now, and so this is the last section that I completed, which I completed this last year. And it's about Oil City, which is a section of Rochester on the Great Western where there was a concentration of oil dealers, and they kind of nicknamed it Oil City. But this was the introduction slide. It's a Walt Dunlap photo, just kind of getting everybody introduced to the Great Western and then in Rochester. I model 1965. I picked it because I had a lot of information from that time period, train lists and things like that. So in order to get a kind of a feel, we got to go back to the Rochester of 1965. And we'll kind of go, there'll be a little bit of audio here, but we'll go back to the Rochester 1965.
The following program is brought to you in living color on NBC.
So here's a map of the Great Western to get anybody kind of orientated. Gives you a general idea where the Great Western went to, but the area that I focus on is kind of this area in northern Iowa and southern Minnesota, specifically here with these branch lines that ran from Osage up through McIntyre, Rochester up to Red Wing, and then over to Winona. Rochester is the area that the layout that we'll be focusing on. It was kind of the main division point on these branch lines that kind of run as a, if you looked at it, kind of like a crooked number 7 there, but it was where the roundhouse was and where the crews were based out of there. And then they were also based out of Red Wing and Mankato. But most of the action was in Rochester. This is kind of an overview of simplified map of the Northwestern and the Great Western going through Rochester in my time period. And the Northwestern on their line from Winona over to Mankato, which was then now the DM&E and now CP or CPKC, whatever. But anyway, most of the business was located on the CGW at Rochester. They had the majority of all the business in Rochester. There were industries along the Northwestern, but most of the big accounts were located on the Great Western. And there's basically, when I started to think about modeling Rochester, I kind of split it into 3 areas that I wanted to model, which is the depot area, which is just east of downtown. And then the yard area where there was Rochester Dairy in the yard. They had a small yard there. And then south of Highway 14 was the Libby's area where the Libby's vegetable canning plant was. And then south of town, in my time, would be just the edge of town, is the Oil City area. At this time, Rochester was about 52,000. Now it's over about 110, 120,000. So the depot area, this is kind of a Walt Dunlap shot of the depot area downtown. You can see the depot to the left. There was a Rodas feed mill. There was a power plant downtown, various industries along this kind of street running track that they had that went downtown. I did not model this area on the layout. This is just north of where I modeled. I start modeling at the yard, which is just the area south of this. There's another overhead shot. You see the freight house. You see downtown Rochester there in the background. So then we'll talk about the yard area. So this is with the beginning of the area that I model of Rochester on the layout. So the yard area, this is looking south. Highway 63 is, US Highway 63 is to the right there. But it was a small, compact yard. It wasn't much yard there at all. But they had to make use of what they had. But they had some very, substantial industry for that area anyway. In the Rochester area, and like I said, the yard was small and compact. You can see Rochester Dairy, which was a large milk processing plant down there on the bottom of the photo. This is kind of looking north, giving another shot of where the roundhouse area and stuff. These were taken about 1949. They had a small turntable and engine facility. This is about 1963. In my time, the roundhouse was taken down from 6 stalls to 3. And you can see just how small, compact everything is. You can see the Mayo Clinic building in the background. Another shot of the small engine house. This is all in the yard area. So this is how I laid the yard out on my layout. Pretty compact. Oh, I was almost able to build it to scale. If you want to know more about that, I think it was MRP, last year's MRP. I did an article about this area. Here's a shot of the yard as I modeled it at Rochester. And, you know, they had to make room or had to make space wherever they could. So a lot of times where you see that plow in the back, that was the coal track where the coaling tower for the steam locomotives were. Well, they would park the snow plow when in not use up on that coal dock there, and that ramp track that went up the coal dock they would use to shove to store cars because they were so cramped for room at times in that small yard. Here's an overview kind of showing the general layout of the yard on the railroad. It sits on a peninsula. Like I said, it's the very end point of the branch line up to Rochester on my layout. But yeah, I was able to model it nearly to scale. Here's that article that tells more about it if you want to look it up in the Model Railroad Planning in 2022. Gives you more in depth about the area. And then to the south of there was the Libby's area. So we cross US Highway 14, which was east-west. And we go to Libby's area. And the Libby's area was located just south of Highway 14. There was a large canning factory there that canned corn, peas, and carrots. This area also included a couple of lumber yards and Woodruff Plumbing and Heating, which was a plumbing wholesaler. The plant was demolished here. They stopped using the facility probably about 5-10 years ago. And they demolished the plant, but the city was able to save that Iroquois water tower. And so that's become a landmark there. They actually repainted it and refurbished it, and it's lit up at night just like it always had been. But the city actually was there was an effort in the city of Rochester to save it. So it's still a Rochester icon. Here's some prototype photos of it as the local there going south towards Rochester, and you can see the Iroquois water tower in both pictures. Here's the area on the layout. The lumber yard in the front here, and then to the right of the lumber yard is the Woodruff Plumbing and Heating, which was a plumbing heating wholesaler, and then the Libby's canning factory to the rear there. Then to the south of that was the Oil City area. This is 1954 aerial, and I'll just read this. About organized in 1930, the Cooperative Oil Company of Rochester owned a parcel of land south on the outskirts of Rochester, directly west of the municipal airport. Now, if you're familiar with Rochester, the municipal airport where it is now is not where it was when I model. It was actually closer to downtown. But anyway, at this time, it was directly west of the Oil City area, it was directly west of the municipal airport. A small warehouse was located there. However, the main warehouse and storage facility was located just a half mile from downtown. So Co-op Oil had this land on the south end of town, and they built their own, because they didn't have room downtown to build it. So they built another facility for warehousing to the south end of town. Well, during World War II, and because you have the Mayo Clinic downtown, during World War II, there was newspaper articles talking about, well, they were worried about a potential terrorist attack or sabotage, and it being in the Mayo Clinic there, they were worried about that they would target the oil dealers that were located along the Northwestern and along the Great Western that were right close to downtown. So Cooperative Oil, being a homegrown company, a hometown company, decided to move all their bulk facility out here, which is highlighted there in the box. And they ended up selling the rest of the land to other various oil dealers that decided to locate out there too. And this area became known as Oil City. Here's the cooperative oil companies there when they built the new bulk facility out there during the 40s. And their premonition turned correct, because on August 1st, 1951, it wasn't a terrorist attack, but they had a fire. And this is at their new facility that they just had built out at the Oil City area. So it wasn't probably maybe less than 10 years after they moved their warehousing and all that stuff to the south of town in the Oil City area, they had a large fire. And you can only imagine what that would have been had it been downtown. It could have spread very easily. Here's another shot of the fire. You can see downtown, you can see the Iroquois water tower on the left hand corner of the photo up towards the top, and then just to the north of that would be downtown. But you can see how this, at this time in the 50s, this was the very edge of Rochester. You can see the airport off to the right. And if you look where that white kind of rounded roof building is, that hangar there, there's a switch engine out there. The switch engine crew saw the fire, and they took the switch engine out there to look at to watch the fire and to see if they needed any help moving any tank cars or anything around. But the switch crew actually came out there during the fire. So I had to research this area, Oil City, to see how, see what was out there. And, there's so little on the Great Western in Rochester that it was hard to come up with resources, but I was able to dig up a few. One of them was using this Directory of Industries from 1957, which is just basically like a phone book or a directory that would list every town, and then it would list every firm alphabetical order, and then what that firm's business was, what they were in business for. And it also denotes reciprocal switching status. So that kind of helped to know, because if a company didn't have reciprocal switching, they were probably captive, right? They probably were on one line or the other. So if it said no reciprocal switching and they're located on the Great Western, chances are they were probably out there in the Oil City area, because I had no idea exactly what, other than Cooperative Oil, who owned the land, I'd had no idea exactly what oil dealers in Rochester were out there. But these are the 3 pages that deal with Rochester. And so I went down and I started highlighting all of the petroleum dealers in Rochester. So we have Ackerman, and you have Bemmel Auto Parts. I knew that there was a scrapyard out there, but I didn't know exactly where. And the cities, City Oil, Continental Oil, Cooperative, DX, Phillips, Pure Oil. These are all in Rochester. I don't know, but by indicating that they had no reciprocal switching was a good idea that they were probably not downtown, and they were probably out there at Oil City. Rasmussen Oil, Skelly Oil, you had a Skell Gas, which is propane, Saucony, Standard. So you had quite a few oil dealers out there. So looking at that list, I came up with about 10 or 11 oil dealers in Rochester. Now I had to find out which ones were still downtown or located elsewhere, and which were the ones that were moved out to Oil City. So most of these firms did not have, like I said, reciprocal switching. So this gives an indication that these may be ones that were located out in Oil City. But I wanted to find out a little bit more. Well, 3rd Avenue Southeast runs north and south, just west of the Oil City area. And so though these oil dealers should have an address of whatever, right, or 3rd Avenue Southeast. So I got a 1962 Rochester City Directory, which would show, the city directory is divided by names, and then it's divided by, you can look by streets, and you can look by address. So I went down and found the area of the directory that indexed 3rd Avenue Southeast. And so I started reading from 17th Street, which is where the Oil City area on the north side begins, and started reading down and to see if I could see what oil dealers were out there. So here we go. We found Continental Oil, DX, Skelly, Mobil, all had addresses along that road. Cooperative Oil, which we knew was out there. Pure Oil, Rochester Oil and Gas, Sinclair, Cities, Service, Standard, Skelly. So we get almost like 10 or 11 oil dealers in this 2-block area. So then I had to dig up and try and find maps and aerial photos and whatever photos I could find of that area. And there wasn't all that much out there, and not a lot of it's left. A lot of it's all grown up around there, and it's kind of become a small area where it's been residential around it, but there's been small businesses that had moved in and relocated and tore down a lot of what was there in my time. But I had a map that gave kind of an overview of how the track arrangements, and the track arrangement was really interesting. And there had this interesting switchback configuration. You can see the junkyard off to the right that bottom track kind of dead ends into, and then you have another track that goes the other way into an oil dealer, and you can see kind of where the tanks are drawn out, where the oil dealers and stuff are. And then there was an IBM warehouse out there. So here's 1954 on the left, and you can see, the oil dealers are starting to pop up out there, and you can see the in the 1954 photo on the bottom left, the small junkyard. And then you can see by 1972, there's more development out there and more oil dealers, and the IBM warehouse on the bottom right has been built. And you can see that the junkyard has now expanded the entire width of that area. You can see there's been propane tanks dealer is out there. So that's probably that Skelly LP gas, but I didn't have any like ground shots of this area. But you can see where, I highlighted here kind of where I saw where their expansion is. So I got to kind of figure out between 1954 and 72, kind of a happy medium. Here's a more, probably in the 70s too, but that gives a different angle of the area. But you can see all the oil dealers in this area. And then the one junkyard. So roughly looks to be, I kind of took this photo and grouped together what looked to me like individual dealers. Not to say that they were, but I got about 7 to 10 dealers, separate dealers out there on that 72 photo. Here's what it looks like today. You still see a couple tank farms. You still see a couple of the warehouse buildings. The junkyard off to the right is not really a junkyard anymore. But and the propane tanks are still there for the Skelly on the right lower, but not a whole lot there. So it was time to just kind of cut the losses that I had, as far as not being able to come up with a lot of information about that area. I knew that that Co-op Oil was out there, but it was time to start building it. So I decided I would just pick a few dealers that I wanted to model. And so it was time to start building it. So this is kind of the area looking north, and it's just 1x4 bench worth with 2x2 legs. So this area that we're looking at right in front of us will be where the Oil City area is. And then the Libby's area is in kind of that part that juts off to the left there at an angle. And then the center part in the room, that peninsula, is where the yard area for Rochester was eventually built. So the total area for Oil City was about 2.5 feet wide by 9 feet long. I glued down some foam, 2-inch foam to the 1x4s, and then I topped it with acoustic ceiling tile to kind of stop the drumming and stuff that happens when you lay foam. If you were lay track right over the top of foam, you kind of get a noise issue. So I always use acoustical tile on top. And then the track is just laid directly on top of the acoustical tiles and held in place with pins with carpet tacks until it's ready to be glued and ballasted. So like I said, due to lack of space, I only had room for 4 or 5 oil dealers that could be modeled. Well, according to a retired Great Western conductor, Jack Fuller, who I interviewed before he passed away about working in Rochester, that IBM warehouse that was out there was only used for a short period of time. So this left a space if I didn't want to model that, because it really wasn't rail served. It was a warehouse where they would part things out. When IBM would take in machines on trade, they would ship them out to that warehouse and they were parted out. Well, IBM built a brand new facility in the late 50s, early 60s on the north side of town, which was rail served also. And they kind of abandoned that warehouse. It wasn't used for rail service anymore. So it was kind of a dead industry by the time I modeled. So I could take that out and put something else in there to give me, more room for more oil dealers. But in place of the IBM warehouse, I decided to substitute Rochester Fertilizer, which was actually on the north side of town, on the area that I don't model. But if I put it in Oil City where the IBM warehouse was, it would give some operational value other than just tank cars and scrap cars going into the Oil City area. So I decided to kind of substitute those two industries. So I could have covered hoppers, I could have tank cars of acid and tank cars of fertilizer going in there, and box cars. So there's where the IBM warehouse was built. And like I said, by my time, it wasn't getting any rail service at that time. So I decided that's where I was going to put the Rochester Fertilizer. So Clark had some buildings from his old layout for Mason City, and the one on the left is the Swift fertilizer plant that was down at on the south end of Mason City on the M and St. L. And then he had this cooling shed that he used for his armor, his Decker plant on the north side of town. I had those two structures that that saved, and I figured, well, I would recycle those and use them for the Rochester fertilizer because they look fairly similar. So I kind of roughed them in place. I filled in the cooling shed that was open. I filled it in with styrene and added some sliding doors and a motor on the top for the screw elevator to make it like a flat storage building, put some hatches on top, set the Swift fertilizer plant building in place and kind of use it as a placeholder while I figure things out of how I was going to build Oil City. You can see the Bemmel Iron and Metal, the scrap yard. I got Gons there on that stub. That's where the scrap dealer was going to be. And so here it is kind of roughed in of where I'm going to put things on that side of the south into Oil City. Liquid tanks for liquid fertilizer and ammonia were added to the rear of the building. You can see that in that bottom there photo where they could unload things out of tank cars at Rochester Fertilizer. And I also added a brick office to the front of the building that Clark had given me. Here's the back area of Rochester Fertilizer in the Oil City area where they would unload tanks after it was finished. And then there's the cooling shed half that he had against his backdrop for his packing plant on his MSNL layout. And after I weathered it, filled it all in and made it a flat storage building where they would unload hoppers in that overhead door, through that overhead door garage on the Rochester Fertilizer building. It would go up that conveyor and be dumped over into the flat storage building. So potash and fertilizer and stuff could be stored in there, and then you could have an inloader go in the doors and scoop it out and load it into trucks. So here's the finished Rochester Fertilizer facility for Rochester, or for in the Oil City area. So the next thing was to lay out then the scrap yard. I had bought these precast scrap pieces or scrap piles, and I had painted them, and then I had with a rust color, and then went back through with a colored pencil and colored individual pieces here and there and painted a few to kind of give the junk piles a better look so they're not so monochromatic. And in order to make them look better and a little more convincing, I dug holes in the ceiling tile to sink them down in so they would set into the scenery so it would look better, would blend more in, so they wouldn't just look like they were sitting on top of the ground, they were actually part of it. So there it is, where I dug in and then I painted it with my base color brown. There's where I'm kind of roughing things in still. And to make them look, if you look at that back slide, they're down in the scenery now, but I needed dirt and I needed stuff, but I can't, junkyard's dirty. There's shit all over a junkyard. Well, I had to somehow get some chaff and some small junk and everything to kind of blend everything in together with the ground cover and the dirt that I was going to lay down. So I needed to come up with a source of loose junk to scatter around the yard and around these preformed piles so it would look more convincing. And this is what I came up with. Now, many of you know I work for the railroad and I'm an engineer, and a lot of times when we're sitting in sidings at towns and stuff like that, we're around grain elevators. Well, anyway, every grain elevator has always got all these seals from hopper cars laying around, and they're rusty and they're thin and they're, I don't know, maybe a 1/4 inch wide and you can cut them up and you can bend them pretty easily. So I figured I started picking some up. I thought, well, maybe I can cut some of these up. They're already pre-rusted. I don't really have to do much weathering and stuff for them. And I used a colored pencil on them, and it gave a look of like painted, rusty painted metal, and they looked pretty good. And I started cutting them up into random pieces, and I thought that makes pretty good cut up pieces of scrap. So I cut up a bunch of them and left some of the newer ones that I did find silver, and then some of them were actually still had some red paint on them. Some had some yellow, some of them I colored with colored pencil. And I took some pieces of an old dryer vent and to get some like aluminum looking things, and I cut them up all in little pieces, and some braided wire and some odds and ends I had on the workbench, and I scattered it all around after I laid the dirt down. And then you can see where I've washed it now with the white glue and water mix, and then now it's setting in place. And so this is, you can see the cast pile, the resin pile that's set down in the scenery, and then I piled up all this other junk around it to make it piles look more convincing. And so here's what the finished product looks like once you scatter all that other stuff around the pile to kind of blend it in with the scenery around it. There's another shot after the scrapyard is finished. And here's kind of an overview showing how just laying that stuff around in different areas and stuff really blends them piles in pretty well and gives an overall good effect for scrap. And then also I had a bunch left over that I had cut up, and I used that for live scrap loads coming in and out of the scrap dealer there. But this is how it looked when I was done, and the railroad continues on. You can see it up at the top of the photo. It continues on to Simpson, Minnesota, which is the next station south of Rochester on the branch line. So I needed a view block here, right? Because it just goes off into nothing there. So I decided I was going to put a backdrop there, and this is how much difference a backdrop on an area like this would make. Here it is before. I put the backdrop in the area of the south end is finished for Royal City on the south end side. So it doesn't look very good with it without anything back there. But when you put something back there, it makes a hell of a difference. So I decided to put the backdrop back there, and this would be, after the backdrop's in place, this would be looking at a scrap car spotted into the scrap dealer there. That Clark had these pictures. He had taken these pictures in Mason City years ago, and I had used this tree line and just stitched together a bunch of them together to make backdrops on other parts of the railroad. But when I asked him to stitch them together for me, he forgot to take out he took out the power poles, but he forgot to take out the power lines. So the power lines were still in the photo themselves. So instead of cutting this back down and redoing it, I left the sky in there, and I decided, well, I just take a skewer, and I took a skewer and put a light fixture on it, and I put it in front of the backdrop and lined it up with the pole, or with the electrical line that was still printed on the photo in the backdrop, and it turned out pretty good. So I didn't have to redo the backdrop. I just put a skewer and a light pole and lined it up with the electrical line, and it looks pretty good. So anyway, so now it's time to build the oil dealers. So we got the south part of Oil City done, and now it's time to fill in the rest with oil dealers. So I had to choose the ones I wanted to do. We knew that Co-op Oil was in that area because of the fire. But all these other ones, I had to come up with what I wanted to choose using the information I had from the directory. Well, I choose to model Co-op Oil because we knew that was there because of the fire. And they would also receive all different brands of lubricants. They weren't any like maybe brand specific. So they, you would get box cars of stuff, and they could also sell tires and batteries at that time. So you get a variety of loads. So of course we'd have to have Co-op Oil because we knew it was there. Sinclair, I decided to put down there because I chose that because of the availability of the accurate tank car that Tangent came out with, and I had a couple of those. Pure Oil was just a personal favorite, and then Standard Oil on account of the Rapido model. So those are the 4 oil dealers I chose to put down, and that I had room for, that I chose to put down in Oil City. So this is kind of the layout that I came up with for Oil City. Bemel iron and metal, we've seen that's already done. Rochester fertilizer was done. This is what I came out then for the layout for the rest of Oil City. Greenway Co-op was the largest oil dealer down there, so I made him relatively large. Standard, I gave them a boxcar warehouse, and I gave them also a tank farm, and then Pure Oil, and then I put Standard over on the other side. So this is me kind of going through and laying out, just trying to figure out how things are going to fit. What I had room for. I didn't want to make it look too crowded, but things were packed in there pretty tight in real life, but I didn't want to overdo it. So I just kind of fiddled around and worked with things. Well, they had Co-op Oil had these tanks on the scaffolding like this, these raised horizontal tanks. So that was one of the first tank farms that I built, and I built it on a piece of styrene. So then I grassed first. so I could get the grass and stuff and gravel underneath of it. And then I built the scaffolding and then laid the tanks horizontally on it. So this is the finished product before I placed it. Then I could cut in a area, the ceiling tile, and place it in as one unit, and then put scenery around it. It's a lot easier to do that and trying to build into place. Here's the back side where the tank cars, where they could walk off of that catwalk there and onto the dome of the tank cars. This is the front where they would load the trucks. Could pull up there, and then they'd have the different hoses to load the tank trucks. This is the tank car farm for Pure Oil. This is the same kind of thing. I built the tanks on a separate piece of styrene that I could grass around, and then put the cement pillars up, and then put my tanks up, put a little advertising on there. Had the phone directory for Rochester, so I knew the phone number for Pure Oil. So I put the actual phone number, Rochester phone number, for Pure Oil on the tank. And this is Pure Oil once I got him done. That's an old Walthers kit there, that radial roof building. And then there's another building I put in the background, a couple horizontal tanks, and then I got 3 horizontal tanks, and a couple vertical tanks. That where they would unload box cars there on that platform, I built that little out of just scrap pieces of wood I had, but they had a floor pump inside. So if you look inside the building, you can see that there's a floor pump in there, and they would use that to pump out into the tanks. And they had a system of valves and stuff that they could put into the horizontal tanks, but they just would open up that garage door and they could hook up a tank there in front of the warehouse there and unload that way. There's a kind of a inside view. What I did was I found a photograph of a petroleum warehouse online, and then I put a piece of styrene up. Before I put the roof on, I put a piece of styrene up in the back, kind of an inch or so back from that open garage door, and that's just a photograph of a inside of a petroleum warehouse to give it a little more depth in there. So it's just not completely black. You can actually see a little bit back in there. So, and then I built the pump and placed it next to the door. Standard Oil. This is named after Mike Moore, a friend of ours who passed away here a few years ago. I made it next to just north of Bemmel Iron and Metal. He has 4 vertical tanks there, and then they also in the back had a warehouse where they would get tires and batteries and things like that. So box cars would get spotted there. So that's the finished warehouse for him. And then we got Co-op Oil, which is just to the north of him, and this is the finished area for. You can see the horizontal tanks on the scaffolding that I built there. I got a couple vertical tanks, and then you have another warehouse there. It's not like what the prototype picture showed, because it was ruined by fire. That warehouse, that a radial roof warehouse that was there in the picture, when they first built out there, that was destroyed in the fire, and then they built a steel warehouse instead. And then they must have at some time, then they built this brick addition that was on to the south of it. So I just kind of just going by aerial photos and basic shapes by looking at, I got close to what I could see what was there in my time from the aerial photos. I did not have any ground level photos of the area after the fire. It's just another shot of the oil dealer there. There's the other end of the warehouse there at for Co-op Oil. Guess that's just the same shot there, just a little closer. And then Sinclair Oil in the back. These are just some buildings I had left over. The dealer that was back here actually had a steel warehouse, but I had these brick warehouses left over, and then Clark built me another one to match. He had some of that brick paper left. And so what I did was I put 3 vertical tanks for petroleum products. Then I put a pump house there, that small pump house in the middle. And then there's a horizontal tank and a vertical tank. That would be for unloading, where they could steam cars and they could unload asphalt tanks there. And then you have a small narrow warehouse where they get box cars. They could unload drums and other petroleum and tires and things like that. And that out of that freight door on that longer building there. Here's kind of a close-up shot there. This time, there's a lot of paving projects going on in rural areas. So some of these towns, a lot of small towns, Rochester too, but they would get a lot of car in the summertime and stuff. They would get a lot of cars asphalt. Here's just kind of a close up of how I do my unloading facilities. And this is just, I just see this stuff a lot from, there's a place down in Omaha, Monarch Oil, that gets tank cars of petroleum and asphalt stuff in, and all they have down there is basically a setup just like this. Now they have pans and stuff, but of course in my time they wouldn't have pans, so the stuff would just drip all over and contaminate the ground. But yeah, it's basically just going into the pump house there, and then there's just a long feeder pipe that goes out, and then there's several connections along that feeder pipe that they could run hoses off of. So anyway, so when it's all said and done, this is kind of Oil City looking from the Iroquois and Water Tower and the layout looking south. This is what it looks like when it's completed. If you took just this area from where this yellow house is where the Oil City area begins behind him, if you took from that street south, you could actually make this just a little switching layout. It could stand on its own with that little switch, that switchback configuration. It makes for some interesting switch moves. So we'll kind of now look at some operations photos of Oil City. So this is what we started with, kind of the information we had from the area photos. And this is how I ended up modeling it. This is kind of a overview shot of how my interpretation of Oil City and Rochester turned out. There it is looking. The main line there goes behind the backdrop of Oil City, and then that ends up going down to Simpson, Minnesota, which is the next town south of Rochester. So this is the very edge of the city of Rochester on my layout, but you can see the lead that goes down. It actually goes downhill. There's a slight grade that and it did in actuality go down grade a little bit and then go down into this Oil City area. I had this area in front of Co-op Oil there. You can see where that shelf is, where the arrow is. That was just kind of an open area where it was just going to be parking lot and stuff for Co-op Oil, and probably some trees and stuff was there. Well, it was a large enough area that I could cut out and I could sink it down, and I ended up making a shelf out of it, because when you're switching Oil City, you've got your switch list and clipboard and stuff there, and it's a nice place to lay your skewers or your clipboard or your paperwork, stuff like a throttle, can of pop, whatever. So instead of just making that just kind of a blank area where it's just going to be parking on a couple of vehicles or trees that would get in the way of reaching, I just basically took that area, cut the foam out, sunk it down, and made a nice shelf there. This is the road that's just on the north side of Oil City. Kind of gives a transition from the residential area down back to the Oil City area. Here's the switch engine going down to Oil City, crossing that road right before he gets to the switch to go down into Oil City. This is another shot of the Oil City area looking south. You can see the Bemmel Iron and the Rochester Fertilizer in the background. And here's one looking north from the scrapyard. Here's my friend Scott Thornton. This gives you kind of idea how big everything is, how deep it is. It's not too deep. You can pretty much reach everything you need to. There is one switch, that's lead that comes off the main line and goes down into Oil City. That's a switch that I have that you can throw from the fascia that you don't have to lean back and get to. But this kind of gives you idea about how big the area is. Now, when you switch Oil City, like this is a shot of the switch engine crossing that road before it gets to the switch to go down there, you got to have cars on both ends. And I talked to Jack Fuller, who was a conductor on the Great Western, and he said they would do that a lot of times, because you'd have to have your cars for the scrapyard and other dealers that were on the south side would have to be ahead of the engine. And then the tanks and stuff for some of the oil dealers that were on the north side of Oil City would have to be on the other side of the engine. So it's very common and to go down there with cars on both ends. And so that's how we do it when we have operating sessions. There he's kind of slipping down. He's going down grade now into we're standing basically on the road that goes back to Sinclair, and he's just starting to go down the grade into Oil City. There he's kind of going in. So you kind of see how it makes for some interesting switching moves, having cars on both ends, and he's not going to have enough room to go in there and pull that one on the right, which is a Standard Oil. So he'll have to go in and work the scrapyard first, and then go out, and he can probably drop that one off at Sinclair, because that's the track to the very left. He'd have room to do that, but he'll have to go back out to the main and set that scrap car out so he has room to do his switching if he needs that car that's out in Standard. So there's another, he's reaching in another operating session, going down there and getting, he's got a couple cars, it looks like, for the Rochester fertilizer, which is them covered hoppers. Looks like he's got a box car for probably Co-op oil. Just some different switching moves there. He's pulling in front of Pure Oil, and he's pulling out some empty hoppers, probably a potash or fertilizer from Rochester Fertilizer. Then he's going back and shoving to spot a car at Co-op Oil. You can see he's cut his Sinclair tank car off on the lead. You can see up on the top there of the photo in the background, there's a gon that he pulled out of the scrapyard that's loaded. And looks like there's probably an ACL or a NAHX or some type of covered hopper that probably came out of Rochester Fertilizer that he'd put out to the main, come back in, so he could have room to make the seesaw move to get back to Co-op Oil. There he's got his car spotted in there at Rochester Fertilizer. These are just some random shots around the area, around looking here at the back end of Standard Oil, looking towards Rochester Fertilizer and Pure Oil in the background. Another overview shot of that. We've seen that before. There you can see him, he's leaving, or don't forget, he must be cut this video that way that he's coming down. He's coming down, looks like, with an empty four. But you can see there's two asphalt tanks spotted back at Sinclair. He looks like he's shoving down to the scrapyard. Another view of the scrapyard with you can see the skewer better in this picture here, but you can see the power lines and the stuff that's on the backdrop, and then you can see the skewer that I used for the light pole there. Some more shots of inside the scrapyard. This was a cast piece. I don't know. I got an eBay, a cast piece of one cast piece of some junk cars. They're probably maybe a little too new for scrapped at my time, but it's 65. So some of these are maybe 10 years old in there, maybe a little more, maybe a little newer. But anyway, I figured it gave a good, something different than just the piles of scrap. Here's some just random details.
Looks like
some oil drums.
Chevy.
Yeah, so it could be done by that time. Wrecked at that time.
Yeah, there's older ones than that, but in the pile.
Yep. And then I just put an old truck back here, and lots of these oil barrels come cast. I think Bar Mills, I think that's who makes them. I can't remember. But anyway, they're all cast one piece, and they're randomly piled up together, and some of them are open and some of them have the lids on the drums and stuff. So I piled them up different places and just scattered some odds and ends around the oil dealers. This is just the road looking back. I fenced in the parking lot at Rochester Fertilizer with some chain link fence just to make it look a little different than the rest of the parking lots. Then there was this area just to the north behind that yellow house. I needed a transition there, so I made a small puddle and put a small pond back there and put an oil barrel and a couple tires in there and cut another rusty oil barrel and put some trees around it, and it gives a nice little transition into the Oil City area on the north side along the road. And that's it. That's how I did finish the layout. That was the last part. And these are the photo credits. And if you want to know more, I've got that Facebook page. If you guys are on Facebook or something like that, there's a ton of more pictures on there. And if there's any questions or anything like that, I'd be more than happy to answer them.
I think it's just a really nice looking layout.
I appreciate it.
Good job doing all that detailed research. And
yeah, it's beautiful.
then
Nice job,
down,
Jason. Thanks
And
for
then
the,
compressing what you could to get, a good representation in there.
Yeah, it's hard because there's just not a lot of pictures.
Well, you can't do
And,
10 oil dealers unless you got a much longer layout.
Yep, exactly.
But that looks really great.
and Jim's our tank guy, so all the tanks were in the right spots, huh, Jim?
I checked, I was
Uh-huh.
looking at those truck racks and the hoses and all that. Looked good to me.
All right.
Jason,
So-
what are your couplers?
What are my couplers?
Yeah, are those sergeants?
No, no, they're just
Like
KD
caboose?
scale. Yeah,
Okay.
they're just KD scale. This is a caboose. The Great Western had the cupola cabooses, and they cut the cupola off two of their northeastern style cupola cabooses, and they added an all-weather window to make a bay window. So this is a project that I did. This is on that street that's just to the north of Oil City. But this is a project I did here last winter. I wanted to make one of them homemade bay window cabooses out of one of those northeastern style cabooses they had.
Nice, Jason. Thanks so much. Great presentation. I noticed that in one of the last pictures there was a automobile and it didn't have the wheels turned. So I wonder if Clark has a comment on that.
Well, I checked the dates on that Edsel. It was parked in one of those last photos, and that's 58 to 60 was when I did the Edsels. So that fits in, it would have been about
Good.
5 or 6 years old at the time this was done.
Yeah. Well, good.
Yeah.
Yeah, my dad's 57 Mercury was a rusted piece of junk by 1962.
There you go. See,
That's true.
so
Those guys didn't last that long.
Well, there was that 58 Chevy, it looked like Impala, that was in the junk heap. And it wasn't all that old at that time. It must have had a bad accident.
yeah, it could have been wrecked. I was just happy to find some cars that were kind of piled up like that because it added a little different, scrap pile. Instead of just the cut up scrap, you could add, junk cars. And I don't know if you can still get them, but I found it on eBay and I figured, well, I'll set that in there. So worked
Yep.
out
Yeah.
well.
Yeah, it looks great. Well, thanks again, Jason. We don't have anybody scheduled for next week yet, I don't think. So if you're interested in presenting, let me know and we'll get you on the schedule. And I'm sure we'll have something. If not, we'll just get together and chew the fat. So join us next week for that. You won't want to miss it. And everybody have a great Thursday. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks again, Jason.
Okay, thanks to
Bye-bye.
everybody.